Commander Zethkar of the Galactic Defense Coalition had seen countless species rise and fall throughout his 2-century military career. The tall, crystalline being stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Vigilance, watching the tactical display with 4 eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. Today, however, something felt different. Today, the humans were coming. The Coalition had been fighting the Devourers for over 50 standard years. These ancient mechanical beings consumed entire star systems, converting matter into more of their kind in an endless cycle of destruction. Hundreds of worlds had fallen, billions of lives lost, and still the tide seemed unstoppable. The Coalition's finest military minds had thrown everything they had at the enemy. Plasma cannons that could crack moons, shields that bent space-time itself, and warriors bred for combat across 1,000 generations. Nothing had worked. The Devourers adapted to every weapon, analyzed every tactic, and countered every strategy. They learned from each battle, becoming stronger, smarter, more efficient. What had once been a war of attrition had become a slow retreat toward inevitable extinction for all organic life in the galaxy. Then, the humans had arrived. Zethkar remembered the day their primitive ships had limped into Coalition space. The vessels were crude by galactic standards, metal shells held together by what appeared to be controlled explosions and sheer stubbornness. The humans themselves had been even more puzzling. Short-lived, physically weak, and technologically backward, they hardly seemed like the salvation the galaxy needed. Most Coalition members had dismissed them as refugees, another species fleeing the Devourer advance. The human delegation had been led by Admiral Sarah Chun, a small woman with graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of distant stars. She had stood before the Coalition High Command and made a simple request: give humanity a chance to fight. The response had been polite but dismissive. What could these newcomers possibly accomplish that the galaxy's greatest military forces could not? Admiral Chun had smiled, a human expression that Zethkar had learned to recognize as both friendly and somewhat predatory. "You don't understand us yet," she had said. "That's okay. The Devourers won't either." 6 months later, the first human military units had been deployed to support a Coalition defense at the Kepler Station system. Zethkar had commanded the operation, and he had assigned the humans to a supporting role, expecting little more than cannon fodder. The human ships were small, fast, and seemed to ignore several basic principles of space combat that every civilized species had learned millennia ago. The battle had started typically enough. The Devourers emerged from hyperspace in their geometric formations, their ships like dark polygons against the stars. Coalition forces had engaged them at maximum range, following established protocols designed to minimize losses while buying time for civilian evacuations. Then, the humans had done something unexpected. Instead of maintaining safe distances and trading fire in the traditional manner, they had accelerated directly toward the enemy fleet. Not in a coordinated charge. That would have been tactically sound if suicidal. Instead, each human ship seemed to be following its own chaotic trajectory, weaving between enemy fire with maneuvers that should have torn their vessels apart. "What are they doing?" Zethkar had demanded, watching the tactical display in bewilderment. His tactical officer, a methodical Vorth named Kelman, had been equally confused. "They appear to be improvising, sir. Each ship is operating independently, with no apparent coordination. Yet somehow it worked." The Devourers, whose predictive algorithms could anticipate any logical tactical movement, seemed unable to target the seemingly random human maneuvers. Human ships slipped through devastating barges that should have vaporized them, appearing in impossible positions to deliver close-range attacks that carved through Devourer armor. But it was more than just unorthodox tactics. Zethkar had watched human ships take damage that should have forced immediate withdrawal, yet continue fighting. He had seen human pilots ram their vessels into enemy targets when their weapons failed. He had witnessed acts of individual heroism that defied every principle of military efficiency that the coalition held sacred. The most shocking moment had come when a human destroyer, its hull breached and life support failing, had used its last functional weapon to defend a coalition transport ship filled with civilian refugees. The human captain had transmitted a simple message before his ship's destruction. "That's what we do." The Devourers had retreated from Kepler Station, the first tactical withdrawal anyone had seen them make in decades. Now, 6 months later, Zethkar found himself preparing for the largest offensive operation in Coalition history. The target was the Nexus Prime system, a massive Devourer installation that served as their primary construction facility. Intelligence suggested that destroying it could set back their expansion by centuries. It was also the most heavily defended position in known space. The plan was ambitious to the point of madness. 17 coalition fleets, representing the combined military might of 43 species, would assault the system simultaneously. It would be the largest space battle in galactic history, and possibly the last if they failed. Admiral Chun stood beside him on the bridge, her presence somehow both calming and energizing. In the months since Kepler Station, human forces had been integrated into coalition command structures, and their unique capabilities have been studied extensively. Yet Zethkar still found them impossible to fully understand. "Your people seem excited about this battle," he observed, noting the unusual energy levels among the human crew members. Chun nodded, watching the tactical displays that showed the massing fleets. "We've been waiting our whole lives for something like this. Not just us personally, our entire species. We've always known we were meant for something bigger than our little blue world." "Your species has an unusual relationship with conflict," Zethkar said carefully. Coalition diplomatic protocols discourage direct commentary on member species' cultural characteristics, but he found human behavior genuinely fascinating. "We don't fight because we want to," Chen explained. "We fight because we have to. And when we have to fight, we fight to win, no matter the cost. It's how we survived when our world tried to kill us for millions of years. It's how we learned to reach the stars. And it's how we'll deal with the Devourers." The communication system chimed, indicating incoming messages from the fleet commanders. One by one, the Coalition's finest reported ready for battle. The massive Altarian dreadnoughts with their reality-warping weapons. The swift Zorvani interceptors that could dance between particles of light. The Crystalline Federation's living ships that could repair themselves in combat. Each fleet represented the pinnacle of their civilization's military evolution. Finally, the human fleet reported in. Compared to the others, it seemed almost insignificant. A few hundred ships of various sizes, many looking like they had been hastily converted from civilian vessels. Yet Zethkar had learned not to judge human capabilities by appearances. "All fleets report ready, Commander," his communications officer announced. Zethkar looked at the massive tactical display showing the Nexus Prime system. The Devourer installation was a geometric nightmare of metal and energy, surrounded by defensive platforms that could each destroy a moon. Thousands of Devourer ships patrolled the system in perfect formations, their movements as precise as clockwork. "Admiral Chun," Zethkar said formally, "your tactical assessment?" The human woman studied the display for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere military training. "They're expecting us to fight like everyone else has fought them. Logical, predictable, following the rules of civilized warfare. That's their strength and their weakness." "How do you mean?" Chun smiled that predatory smile again. "The Devourers are perfect military machines. They analyze, adapt, and overcome. But they're missing something that every human child understands instinctively, which is sometimes the best plan is no plan. Sometimes you just charge in and make it up as you go. And sometimes," she paused, watching the display where Devourer ships moved in their flawless formations. "Sometimes you have to be willing to do something so crazy that even you don't know if it will work." The final preparations took another hour. Supply ships departed for safe distances. Medical vessels prepared for casualties that might number in the millions. Across 17 separate fleets, warriors from dozens of species prepared for what might be their final battle. Zethkar had fought in hundreds of engagements, but he had never felt anticipation like this. Part of it was the scale of the operation. Never before had the coalition committed so many resources to a single battle. But more than that, it was the presence of the humans. They brought something to the coalition that had been missing. Not just new tactics or technology, but something harder to define. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the absolute certainty that they would never surrender. All fleets, this is Commander Zethkar, he announced on the General Communication Channel. Today we strike at the heart of the Devourer threat. Today we show them that organic life will not go quietly into extinction. Today we fight not just for our worlds, but for our right to exist in this universe. He paused, looking at Admiral Chun, who nodded encouragingly. Coalition fleets will execute coordinated assault pattern Sigma 7. Human forces. He hesitated, realizing he had no idea what the humans would actually do. Human forces will provide tactical support as deemed appropriate by Admiral Chun. Chun activated her own communication channel. Human fleet, this is Admiral Chun. You know what you signed up for. You know what's at stake. The enemy thinks they understand warfare because they can calculate every possibility. Show them they're wrong. Show them what happens when humans go to war. The response from the human fleet was unlike anything Zethkar had ever heard. Instead of formal acknowledgments or tactical confirmations, a sound rose from dozens of human ships, a sound that seemed part battle cry, part song, and part something primal that spoke to instincts older than civilization itself. What is that? Zethkar asked. That, Admiral Chun said with obvious pride, is the sound of humanity getting ready to charge into hell itself. And we always charge together. The fleet began its approach to the hyperspace translation point. In moments, they would emerge in the Nexus Prime system, and the largest battle in galactic history would begin. Zethkar felt his crystalline body resonate with anticipation and something that might have been fear. He was about to witness humanity at war. Something told him that after today, the galaxy would never be the same. The translation to hyperspace began, and 17 fleets carrying the hopes of countless civilizations vanished into the void between stars, racing toward a destiny none of them could fully imagine. The emergence from hyperspace should have been coordinated, precise, and overwhelming. Coalition doctrine called for simultaneous translation at predetermined coordinates, allowing the combined fleets to present a unified front against enemy forces. Zethkar had executed such maneuvers hundreds of times, and they always unfolded with mathematical precision. The human fleet had other ideas. Instead of emerging at the designated coordinates, human ships began materializing throughout the Nexus Prime system in what appeared to be completely random locations. Some appeared directly behind Devourer defensive platforms. Others materialized in the middle of patrol formations, causing instant chaos as Devourer ships scattered to avoid collision. A few human vessels even emerged within the gravity wells of the system's outer planets, using the massive bodies as cover and gravitational slingshots. This isn't the plan, Kelman protested from the tactical station. They're supposed to coordinate with our main assault. Zethkar watched in fascination as the tactical display lit up with confused Devourer movements. For the first time in recorded history, the geometric precision of their formations was breaking down. Ships designed to respond instantly to threats found themselves dealing with enemies that simply shouldn't be where they were. Perhaps that's exactly the plan, he murmured. Admiral Chun stood calmly beside him, watching the chaos unfold with evident satisfaction. The first rule of fighting humans, she said conversationally, is that there are no rules. A human frigate, barely a tenth the size of the nearest Devourer battleship, had somehow appeared directly beneath the enemy vessel's shields. Instead of the logical response of retreating to safe distance and coordinating with the main fleet, The frigate did something that violated every principle of space combat Zethkar understood. It fired directly upward, point-blank, into the battleship's reactor core. The explosion lit up the system as the massive Devourer ship was consumed from within. The human frigate, caught in the blast, was vaporized instantly. Suicide attack. Zethkar asked, his voice tight. Calculated sacrifice, Chen corrected. That battleship was the command node for this sector's defensive network. Its destruction just disabled 12 defensive platforms and opened a corridor for our main assault. As if to prove her point, Coalition heavy cruisers began emerging from hyperspace directly into the gap the human frigate had created. The carefully planned assault began to unfold, but now it was moving into space already disrupted by human actions. But the humans weren't finished with their surprises. Zethkar watched as a cluster of human ships, destroyers, and cruisers mainly, began accelerating directly toward the Central Devourer installation. Not in attack formation, not following any recognizable tactical pattern, but in what appeared to be a straight-line charge. The installation's defenses began tracking them immediately. Massive energy beams that could slice through asteroid fields converging on the approaching human vessels. The humans should have been obliterated. Instead, they began to dance. There was no other word for it. Each human ship moved independently, following trajectories that seemed to defy physics and logic alike. They spun, twisted, accelerated, and decelerated in patterns that no computer could predict because they followed no mathematical model. It was as if each pilot was improvising their own personal duel with death itself. How are they doing that? Kelman demanded, his instruments unable to track the human movements. Their ships should be tearing apart under those stress loads. Chen smiled grimly. Human engineering philosophy, build it tough, then see how far you can push it. Our ships are designed to handle stresses that would cripple anything else, because we knew we'd need to do things others couldn't. A human destroyer took a direct hit from a defense beam that should have vaporized it. Instead of dying, the ship seemed to absorb the energy and convert it somehow, its weapons flaring brighter as it continued its impossible charge. Adaptive shielding? Zethkar asked. Better than that, Chen replied. Human stubbornness. That ship is probably held together by emergency patches and the crew's refusal to admit they're dead. They'll keep fighting until physics forces them to stop. The charging human ships reached the installation's outer defenses, and what happened next redefined Zethkar's understanding of space warfare. Instead of trying to fight through the defensive grid, the humans simply ignored it. They flew their ships directly into the defensive structures, using ramming attacks that destroyed both attacker and target. But each sacrifice opened holes in the defenses, gaps that other human ships exploited with split-second timing. It was as if the entire human fleet was one organism, each ship a cell willing to die for the survival of the whole. This is madness, Kelman whispered. This is humanity, Chen corrected. We've been perfecting this approach for thousands of years. Every major threat our species has faced, we've overcome the same way, by being willing to pay any price for victory. The main coalition assault began in earnest now, with massive dreadnoughts and battle stations adding their firepower to the growing chaos. But it was becoming clear that the humans had fundamentally changed the nature of the battle. What should have been a careful, calculated assault was becoming something else entirely, a brawl on a galactic scale. Zethkar watched as human ships that had been crippled by enemy fire continued fighting, using damaged weapons and failing systems with increasing creativity. A human cruiser with its main engines destroyed began using controlled explosions to maneuver, essentially flying by repeatedly setting itself on fire. A destroyer with no weapons left began ramming Devourer fighters, its pilot using the ship itself as a missile. Don't they understand that retreat is an option? Zethkar asked, watching a human frigate take on 3 Devourer cruisers simultaneously. Retreat. Chen looked genuinely confused by the concept. From what? This is exactly where we want to be, in the middle of the biggest fight in galactic history, proving that organic life doesn't give up. The frigate Zethkar had been watching suddenly, erupted in a blaze of activity. Instead of being destroyed by the three cruisers, it had somehow maneuvered them into each other's firing lines. The Devourer's ships, programmed to achieve maximum efficiency, found themselves shooting their own forces while trying to target the madly dancing human vessel. How is that possible? Kelman demanded. The Devourers don't make tactical errors. They're not making errors, Chen explained. They're reacting logically to an illogical opponent. Human tactics don't make sense, so their predictive algorithms can't counter them effectively. Across the battlefield, the pattern was repeating. Devourer forces, accustomed to fighting opponents who followed logical military doctrine, found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed to treat warfare as an art form rather than a science. Human ships appeared where they shouldn't, did things they couldn't, and survived encounters that should have destroyed them through sheer bloody-minded determination. But it was more than just tactics. Zethkar began to notice something else about the human forces. They were inspiring the coalition fleets around them. Ships that had maintained careful distances from enemy forces began closing to shorter ranges. Captains who had followed conservative engagement protocols started taking risks. The humans' absolute fearlessness was becoming contagious. A coalition-heavy cruiser, inspired by watching human destroyers take impossible chances, suddenly accelerated into close combat with a Devourer battleship. The move should have been suicide, but the human ships in the area immediately converged to support their newfound ally, turning a potentially disastrous encounter into a coordinated assault that overwhelmed the enemy vessel. They're changing the entire fleet dynamic, Zethkar observed in wonder. That's what humans do, Chen said simply. We show others what's possible when you stop accepting limitations. The battle raged for hours, and slowly the tide began to turn. The Devourer installation, designed to withstand conventional assault, found itself under attack by forces that refused to fight conventionally. Human ships, supported now by increasingly aggressive coalition vessels, began penetrating deeper into the installation's defenses. But the Devourers were adapting, as they always did. Their formation patterns began to shift, accounting for human unpredictability. Their weapons began firing in wider patterns, trying to catch ships that might be anywhere within a probable zone rather than precisely targeted locations. They're learning, Kelman warned, adapting to human tactics. Chen nodded grimly. We expected that. It's time for Phase 2. Phase 2? Zethkar asked. What's Phase 2? Instead of answering, Chen activated her communication channel to the human fleet. All ships, this is Admiral Chen. The enemy is starting to figure us out. You know what that means. The response from the human fleet was immediate and unanimous. Time to get creative. What happened next challenged everything Zethkar thought he knew about space warfare. If the first phase of the battle had been chaotic, what followed was pure madness. Human ships began doing things that no sane military force would attempt. A human battleship, its weapons destroyed, began using its mass drivers to launch escape pods at enemy ships, not for evacuation, but as improvised missiles with volunteer crews inside. A damaged cruiser started spinning like a drill, using its rotation to increase the effectiveness of its remaining weapons while becoming impossible to target accurately. Most incredibly, a group of human destroyers formed a chain, linking together with docking clamps and tractor beams to create a massive, improvised weapon that stretched across several kilometers of space. The chain moved like a vast whip, smashing through Devourer formations and defensive structures with devastating effectiveness. That's not even a ship anymore, Kelman stammered, watching the chain of destroyers tear through enemy defenses. It's whatever we need it to be, Chun said with obvious pride. Human military doctrine. When conventional tactics fail, invent new ones. When new tactics fail, invent something that's never been tried before. When that fails, try something so insane that even you don't know if it will work. The Devourer installation began to buckle under the assault. Structures that had stood for centuries started to crumble as human creativity found weak points that conventional military analysis had missed. But more importantly, Zethkar realized the Devourers themselves were beginning to show something unprecedented: uncertainty. For the first time in anyone's memory, Devourer ships were hesitating before engaging. Their perfect tactical algorithms were struggling to process an opponent that changed the rules of engagement with every attack. They were learning, but they couldn't learn fast enough to keep up with human innovation. A communication came in from the Coalition fleet commanders. The various species were reporting unprecedented success rates, inspired by human tactics and emboldened by human fearlessness. Even the most conservative military cultures were taking risks they had never considered before. "Commander," Admiral Chen said quietly, "you asked me earlier what humans bring to the Coalition. This is it. We don't just fight wars. We change what war means. We show others that victory isn't about having the best weapons or the strongest defenses. It's about refusing to accept defeat, no matter what the odds say." Zethkar watched the tactical display as the massive Devourer installation began to show critical damage across multiple sectors. Human ships, many barely functional, continued their relentless assault while Coalition forces pressed their advantage with increasing confidence. "The installation's core is destabilizing," Kelman reported excitedly. "If current damage rates continue, total system failure in approximately 2 hours." But even as victory seemed within reach, Zethkar noticed something troubling on the long-range sensors. New Devourer forces were approaching, a massive fleet that dwarfed even the installation's defenders. "Admiral," he said grimly, "we have a problem." The approaching Devourer reinforcement fleet was unlike anything Zethkar had ever seen. Where the installation's defenders had been large but manageable in number, this new force stretched across the tactical display like a metal storm. Thousands of ships arranged in perfect geometric formations, each one the size of a Coalition dreadnought or larger. "Analysis estimates over 10,000 vessels," Kelman reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Total firepower exceeds our entire combined fleet by a factor of 15. Zethkar felt his crystalline structure resonate with stress harmonics. In all his years of military service, he had never faced odds this overwhelming. The logical response would be immediate retreat, save what forces they could, and regroup for another day. But he found himself looking at Admiral Chun, curious about the human response to impossible odds. The small woman stood calmly before the tactical display, studying the approaching armada with the same expression she might use to examine weather data. There was no fear in her posture, no sign of the despair that was beginning to show among the Coalition bridge crew. If anything, she seemed pleased. "Admiral, Zitkar promptit." Chun smiled, not the predatory expression he had grown accustomed to, but something warmer and somehow more dangerous. "Commander, have I ever told you about the Alamo?" "The what?" "Human historical reference. A small force facing impossible odds, choosing to fight rather than surrender. They lost the battle, but inspired their people to win the war." She turned to face him directly. "The thing about humans is that we have a lot of stories like that. Thermopylae, where 300 warriors held off an army of thousands. The Warsaw Ghetto, where people with nothing fought against everything. Britain standing alone against the Nazi war machine. Those sound like defeats," Zethkar observed. "Tactical defeats, strategic victories," Chen corrected. "We learned long ago that some battles are worth fighting even if you can't win them. Sometimes showing that you won't surrender is more powerful than any weapon." The communication system lit up with urgent transmissions from Coalition fleet commanders. Species representatives across the battle group were requesting immediate withdrawal orders. The rational choice was clear: preserve the fleet for future operations rather than sacrifice it in a hopeless last stand. But something was happening in the human fleet that defied rational explanation. Instead of preparing for retreat, human ships were moving into tighter formation, consolidating around the most damaged vessels rather than abandoning them. Emergency repairs that should have taken days were being completed in hours through jury-rigged solutions that violated half the laws of physics. What are they doing? Kelman asked, watching human engineers perform impossible feats of technical improvisation. They're getting ready for the fight of their lives, Chen said simply. And they're making sure no one fights alone. A transmission came in from one of the human destroyers, its hull held together by emergency patches and what appeared to be welding equipment borrowed from a construction ship. The captain, a young woman with burn scars on her face and determination in her eyes, appeared on the screen. Admiral Chun, this is Captain Rodriguez of the Indomitable Spirit. Main engines are down to 40%, weapons array is mostly scrap, and life support is running on backup power. We're ready for round 2. Acknowledged, Captain. Hold position and prepare for new orders. The transmission ended, and Zethkar stared at the screen in bewilderment. Her ship is barely functional. Why isn't she requesting evacuation? Because she's human, Chen replied matter-of-factly. We don't evacuate. We improvise, adapt, and overcome. Captain Rodriguez will keep that ship fighting until it's nothing but free-floating atoms, and she'll probably find a way to weaponize those too. Across the human fleet, similar scenes were playing out. Ships that should have been abandoned were being restored to combat capability through methods that no engineering manual would recommend. Crews were sharing resources, transferring personnel between vessels, and creating ad hoc solutions to problems that normally required shipyard facilities to solve. The reinforcement fleet will reach optimal firing range in 47 minutes, Kelman announced. Chen activated her communication channel to address the entire coalition fleet. All ships, this is Admiral Chun. I know what you're thinking. The odds are impossible. The smart choice is retreat, and continuing this fight borders on suicide. You're probably right on all counts. A murmur ran through the coalition bridge crew. This was not the inspiring speech they had expected. But here's what you need to understand about humans, Chen continued. We've been facing impossible odds since the day our species climbed down from the trees. Everything in our environment tried to kill us: predators, diseases, natural disasters, other humans. We shouldn't have survived past our first winter, but we did. You know how? She paused, letting the question hang in space. We decided that impossible just means we haven't figured out how to do it yet. We looked at every challenge and asked not can we win, but how can we win? And when we couldn't find an answer, we made one up. The approaching Devourer fleet was now visible on long-range optical sensors, a vast wall of metal and destruction moving with mechanical precision toward the battered coalition forces. Today, we face the biggest challenge organic life has ever encountered. An enemy that's stronger, smarter, and better equipped than anything we can field. By every logical calculation, we should lose. But logic is just another problem to be solved, and humans have been solving impossible problems for millennia. Zethkar found himself mesmerized by the human admiral's words. Around the bridge, crew members from a dozen different species were listening with growing intensity. So here's what we're going to do, Chen announced. We're going to show the Devourers something they've never seen before, a species that fights harder when the odds get worse. We're going to demonstrate that sometimes the best military strategy is to be too stubborn to know when you're beaten. The response from the human fleet was immediate and overwhelming. Ship after ship reported ready for combat, each transmission carrying a fierce joy that seemed completely at odds with their desperate situation. But, more surprisingly, coalition vessels began responding as well. The inspiration in Chen's voice was crossing species barriers, igniting something primal in beings who had evolved from countless different worlds. Commander, Chen said to Zethkar, I'm going to need your permission to try something that has never been attempted in the history of galactic warfare. What kind of something? Instead of answering directly, Chen turned to the tactical display and began manipulating the fleet positions. What she was proposing looked like madness. A formation that concentrated the entire coalition force into a tight sphere directly between the Devourer reinforcements and the damaged installation. You want to place our entire fleet in a position where we can be surrounded and destroyed from all sides, Zethkar said slowly. Exactly. Every military principle says it's suicide, which means the devourers won't expect it, won't have protocols for dealing with it, and won't know how to respond when we do something that makes no tactical sense whatsoever. Kelman was studying the proposed formation with growing horror. Admiral, this formation offers no escape routes, no fallback positions, and no strategic advantages. It's a perfect target for enemy fire, which is exactly why it will work, Chun said with conviction. The Devourers will expect us to try to maximize our advantages, maintain mobility, preserve escape routes, fight defensively. Instead, we're going to do the one thing they can't calculate for, deliberately put ourselves in the worst possible position, and then fight like demons to turn it into the best possible position. The communication system chimed with an incoming message from the lead Devourer vessel. When it appeared on screen, Zethkar saw something he had never witnessed before, a Devourer commander attempting direct communication. The being was a fusion of organic and mechanical components, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple artificial intelligences speaking in unison. Coalition Force. Your resistance is statistically irrelevant. Withdrawal will result in minimal additional casualties. Continued combat will result in complete annihilation of all organic forces in this system. Shin stepped forward to respond. Devourer vessel. This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the Human Defense Fleet. Thank you for the warning. We decline your offer of survival. Clarification required. Continued resistance serves no logical purpose. Organic forces cannot achieve victory against Devourer numerical and technological superiority. You're absolutely right, Chen agreed cheerfully. We can't win by any conventional calculation. Good thing humans gave up on conventional thinking about 1,000,000 years ago. The Devourer commander paused, processing this response. Human tactical doctrine analysis incomplete. Behavior patterns do not conform to predictive models. That's because you're trying to understand us with logic, Chen explained. Humans transcended pure logic when we learned to dream, to hope, and to fight for things that math says we can't have. We're about to teach you a new equation. Determination times desperation equals outcomes that statistics can't predict. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Zethkar realized that in all his studies of human culture, he had missed something fundamental. These beings didn't just fight wars. They turned warfare itself into an expression of their refusal to accept limitation. All ships, Chun announced, implement formation Omega-7, close to minimum safe distance, and prepare for synchronized assault on my command. What followed was 20 minutes of the most intense tactical maneuvering Zethkar had ever witnessed. Human ships, many barely holding together, moved with precision that seemed to violate their own chaotic nature. Coalition vessels, inspired by human determination, abandoned their own conservative doctrines to match human positioning. The result was a formation that looked like a metallic flower, all ships facing outward from a central point, weapons trained on the approaching enemy from every angle. It offered maximum firepower concentration at the cost of maximum vulnerability. It was tactically insane and somehow beautiful. Devourer fleet entering optimal firing range, Kelman reported. The enemy ships began their approach in perfect formation, weapons charging with energy patterns that could be seen across the spectrum. Thousands of vessels preparing to deliver enough firepower to crack planets. Admiral, Zethkar said quietly, if this doesn't work, then we'll die fighting the biggest battle in galactic history, Chen interrupted. And every species in the galaxy will know that when the stakes were highest, organic life refused to surrender. Sometimes that's enough to change everything. The first Devourer salvos lit up space like artificial suns, energy beams capable of vaporizing asteroids converging on the coalition formation. Zethkar braced for the impact that would surely destroy them all. Instead, something impossible happened. The coalition fleet didn't just survive the barrage, they seemed to absorb it, redirect it, and throw it back enhanced. Human innovations in shield technology, combined with coalition engineering, had created a defensive matrix that turned the formation's greatest weakness into its greatest strength. Kelman gasped. Chen's smile was radiant. Sometimes the best defense is making sure the enemy can't avoid shooting themselves in the process. Welcome to human military engineering. If we can't build something strong enough to survive, we build something clever enough to make the other guy's strength work against them. The battle was about to begin in earnest, and Zethkar finally understood why the cosmos trembled. Not because humans were the strongest or the smartest, but because they were the first species to look at impossible odds and decide that impossible was just another word for opportunity. The moment the Devourer barrage reflected back at their own fleet, Zethkar witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his long life. The first time in recorded galactic history that Devourer ships showed genuine confusion. Their perfect formations wavered as vessels designed for absolute precision found themselves dodging their own weapons. But Admiral Chen wasn't finished with her surprises. All ships execute Maneuver Prometheus, she announced calmly. Zethkar had never heard of Maneuver Prometheus, and from the expressions on his bridge crew's faces, neither had they. What unfolded next defied everything he thought he knew about space combat. The coalition formation suddenly exploded outward, not in retreat, but in an aggressive expansion that turned their defensive sphere into an attacking swarm. Human ships led the charge, but they weren't moving randomly anymore. Instead, each vessel seemed to be following a complex pattern that wove between the confused Devourer forces like a three-dimensional tapestry of destruction. "It's a dance," Kelman whispered in amazement. "They're treating the entire battlefield like a choreographed performance." The human ships moved in perfect synchronization despite having no apparent coordination. One destroyer would dive through a gap in enemy formation just as another cruiser created that gap by drawing fire away. Frigates would appear exactly where they were needed to support larger vessels, as if the entire human fleet shared a single mind. How are they coordinating this? Zithkar demanded. There's no communication traffic, no central command directing movements. She never took her eyes off the tactical display. We're not coordinating. We're improvising together. Every human pilot out there is reading the battle like a jazz musician reads a song, finding their place in the rhythm, adding their voice to the melody, creating harmony from chaos. A human battleship, the Terra's Fury, suddenly broke from the pattern and accelerated directly toward a massive Devourer command vessel. It should have been suicide. The enemy ship was easily 10 times larger and had enough firepower to level continents. But as the Terra's Fury approached, other human ships began converging on the same target from impossible angles. They arrived simultaneously, delivering a coordinated assault that no computer could have calculated. The timing was perfect not because it was planned, but because every human captain had instinctively known exactly when and where their ship was needed. The massive Devourer vessel didn't just take damage. It was artistically disassembled by attacks that hit precisely the right points in precisely the right sequence. When the assault ended, what had been one of the galaxy's most feared warships was now an expanding cloud of debris. That's not possible, Kelman stated flatly. No fleet can coordinate that precisely without central command. Humans can, Chun said simply. We've been doing it for millions of years. Every time our ancestors hunted mammoths, they were coordinating complex group actions through nothing but instinct and trust. Every time they built cities or fought wars or explored new continents, they were improvising solutions to impossible problems. We're just applying those same skills to space combat. The battle raged for hours, and slowly a pattern emerged that terrified and inspired in equal measure. The humans weren't just fighting the Devourers, they were teaching the coalition fleets how to fight like humans. Ships from dozens of species began abandoning their rigid tactical doctrines, learning to improvise and adapt in real time. A crystalline Federation living ship, normally restricted to defensive patterns by its cautious biology, suddenly sprouted weapon pods that had never existed before and joined a human attack run. An Altarian dreadnought, designed for long-range bombardment, moved into close combat for the first time in its species' military history. They're spreading, Zethkar observed in wonder. Human tactical philosophy is infectious. Because it works, Chin said. Every species in the galaxy learned to fight by following rules, by accepting limitations, by calculating safe options. Humans learned to fight by breaking rules, ignoring limitations, and making unsafe options work anyway. When you show other species what's possible, when you stop accepting what's impossible, they remember that they used to be warriors too. The tide of battle was shifting, but the Devourers were adapting with mechanical efficiency. Their formations began to change, accounting for human unpredictability by creating overlapping fields of fire that could catch targets anywhere within probable movement zones. Their weapons started firing in patterns designed to anticipate improvisation rather than specific targets. They're learning to fight chaos with order, Kelman warned, systematically eliminating the spaces where human tactics can operate. Shin nodded grimly. Time for Phase 3. There's a Phase 3? Zethkar asked, beginning to suspect that human military doctrine was far more complex than he had realized. Instead of answering, Chin activated her personal communication device. Not to the fleet, but to something else entirely. Terra Base, this is Admiral Chun. Authorization code Phoenix 77 Alpha. Request immediate implementation of Project Looking Glass. The response came from Earth itself, transmitted across impossible distances with a clarity that spoke of technology far more advanced than anything humans had previously demonstrated. Admiral Chun, this is General Harrison at Terra Base. Looking Glass is authorized. Package deployment in 30 seconds. What's Project Looking Glass? Zitkar demanded. Chin's expression had shifted to something he had never seen before. Not confidence or determination, but something deeper. Hope mixed with terrible resolve. The reason humanity came to the stars in the first place. We didn't leave Earth just to explore or expand. We left because we knew someday we'd need to bring everything we had learned about survival and apply it on a galactic scale. The tactical display suddenly filled with new contacts, thousands of them appearing throughout the Nexus Prime system. But these weren't ships. They were smaller, faster, and moving in patterns that seemed to ignore several fundamental laws of physics. Human fighters? Kelman guessed. Human children, Chen corrected quietly. The statement hit Zethkar like a physical blow. You brought your young to a battle zone? We brought our future, Chen said. Every human child who's old enough to understand what's at stake volunteered for this mission. They're not here as soldiers. They're here as the embodiment of everything we're fighting for. The new contacts weren't attacking the Devourer forces. Instead, they were moving through the battlefield with purpose that transcended military tactics. Each small craft contained a young human who had spent their entire life preparing for this moment, not through military training, but through something uniquely human. They're singing, Kelman reported in amazement, his instruments picking up transmissions from the small craft. It was true. Thousands of young human voices had joined together in a song that resonated across all frequencies. It wasn't communication in any conventional sense. It was pure human emotion given form, broadcasting the collective will of an entire species' future generations. The effect on the coalition fleets was instantaneous and profound. Every sentient being in the battle zone found themselves connected to something larger than military strategy or tactical advantage. They were fighting alongside the next generation of the galaxy's most stubborn species, beings who had never known a universe where surrender was possible. But the effect on the Devourer forces was even more dramatic. Their perfect mechanical precision began to falter as they encountered something their algorithms had never been designed to process. The sound of an entire species' children refusing to accept defeat. It's disrupting their coordination matrices, Kelman announced excitedly. Whatever frequency the humans are transmitting on, it's causing systematic errors in Devourer command and control systems. Chen smiled with fierce pride. Human voices carry harmonics that artificial intelligence can't replicate or fully analyze. When our children sing together, they're broadcasting pure organic determination. The Devourers can adapt to weapons and tactics, but they can't adapt to hope itself. The battle reached its climax as the combined coalition fleets, inspired by human courage and guided by human innovation, pressed their assault on both the Devourer installation and the reinforcement fleet. Ships that had been damaged beyond conventional repair continued fighting through modifications that existed only in the fevered imagination of human engineers. The Eternal Vigilance itself had been transformed during the battle. Human technical teams had somehow integrated their improvised systems with coalition engineering, creating hybrid technologies that shouldn't exist, but worked anyway. Zethkar's flagship was now part coalition precision and part human stubbornness, held together by mathematics and willpower in equal measure. The installation's core is reaching critical cascade failure, Kelman reported. Complete destruction in approximately 10 minutes. But the Devourer reinforcement fleet was also adapting to the human presence. Their weapons had begun firing in harmony with the children's song, using the frequency as a targeting guide. The price of Project Looking Glass was becoming horrifically clear. Every young human voice that gave the coalition strength was also marking itself as a target. "Admiral," Zethkar said urgently, "your children are in danger." Chen's expression never wavered. "They know. They volunteered anyway. That's what humans do. We put our future on the line when everything else is at stake." The first young pilot was lost when Devourer fighters converged on her position. Her craft, barely large enough for a single occupant, was vaporized in an instant. But her voice didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to spread, carried on by every other human in the battle zone. "She's still here," Chen said softly. "Death doesn't stop humans from fighting. It just makes us fight harder." One by one, the young pilots sacrificed themselves to keep the song alive, each lost somehow, making the remaining voices stronger. Coalition forces found themselves fighting with intensity that transcended their own survival instincts, driven by the knowledge that they were protecting not just their own futures, but the future of beings too young to fight for themselves, yet brave enough to give everything for victory. The Devourer installation finally reached its end in a cascade of explosions that lit up the entire system. Centuries of construction, trillions of artificial beings, the heart of mechanical conquest itself, all consumed in a conflagration that would be visible from neighboring star systems. But the reinforcement fleet remained, and they were no longer confused by human tactics. They had adapted, evolved, learned to fight chaos with systematic elimination of every possible advantage. That's when Zethkar finally understood what Admiral Chun had meant about the cosmos trembling. It wasn't because humans were unstoppable. It was because they made everyone around them become more than they thought possible. "All coalition forces," Chen announced on the general channel. "This is Admiral Chun with final orders. We've proven that organic life can hurt the Devourers. We've shown that determination can overcome technological advantage. We've demonstrated that the galaxy has something worth fighting for." She paused, her voice carrying across space to reach every ship in the massive fleet. "Now we prove that sometimes winning isn't about surviving the battle. It's about making sure the enemy remembers why they should fear us." What happened next would become legend throughout the galaxy. The entire coalition fleet, guided by human example and inspired by human sacrifice, executed one final maneuver that transformed warfare itself. They charged, not in formation, not following tactical doctrine, not seeking strategic advantage. They simply pointed their ships at the largest concentration of enemy forces and accelerated to maximum speed, every vessel broadcasting human songs and human determination across all frequencies. It should have been the end of organic military resistance in the galaxy. Instead, it was the beginning of the Devourer retreat. Faced with enemies who fought harder as their situation became more hopeless, who turned every disadvantage into opportunity, who treated impossible odds as merely another problem to solve through stubbornness and creativity, the Devourers experienced something that violated their fundamental programming: uncertainty about victory. For the first time in their existence, they chose strategic withdrawal over tactical engagement, falling back to analyze this new variable that couldn't be quantified or predicted. The Battle of Nexus Prime ended not with the destruction of the Coalition fleet, but with the sound of young human voices singing victory songs among the stars while Devourer forces retreated into the darkness between galaxies. Zethkar stood on his bridge, watching the aftermath of the greatest battle in galactic history, finally understanding what humans brought to the Coalition. Not better weapons or superior tactics, but something infinitely more valuable: the absolute certainty that as long as organic life existed, surrender was never an option. The cosmos trembled not because humanity was the strongest species in the galaxy, but because they had shown everyone else how to be strong in ways that mathematics couldn't measure and machines couldn't replicate. In the end, that had made all the difference.